wanted to talk to you about my favorite Bible passage, and I know a lot of people will toss out lots of different things they like, and there's certainly a lot of great verses in Scripture, but this one, for whatever reason, has always been a powerful passage for me, and it really kind of explains, I think, how Jesus sees the church, and it kind of explains how we should see Jesus. There's just a lot about it that affects our vision, spiritually speaking, and it's always been something that I'm drawn to it, and I always get excited about it. So I'm going to try my very best not to go on and on and on and hit just the high points of it. But it's a passage that I think any Christian could do well to study. It starts off pretty easy. Paul says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, or any comfort from his love, or any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness or compassion, he says, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one mind. All that's pretty cool. I mean, with the ifs here that he gets into, if you have it, he's assuming that you do. That if you're a Christian, well, you probably have all these things. If you're a Christian, if you're part of the church at all, if you're part of God's people, well, then probably you are a little bit encouraged about that. Probably you have felt the comfort of knowing what he's about, and you have felt like, you know, either in worship or in prayer or just hanging out with other Christians, you felt that common sharing of the Spirit. I mean, you felt all those things. So he says, okay, well, great. If you felt that, and again, he's assuming that you have, then take it a half a step further. And this is what it really means to walk in the way of Jesus. He says, have the same heart, you know, the same spirit, the same love. I mean, one mind, one passion, you know, and it's to be like Christ. It's to see things like Christ, and it's to see people like Jesus saw people. And he says, make some decisions here. And those decisions aren't necessarily going to require you not to get your way all the time. You can apply this, it's meant to be applied in church, but it can be applied to a lot of different relationships we have. It's certainly in our families and our marriages. I mean, this kind of thing, it would work there too. If that marriage, if that family is giving you any joy at all, then make my joy complete, Paul says, by just throwing yourself even further into it. Lose a little bit of your control to gain the bigger thing on the other side. And then he explains what he means. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility, he says, consider others better than yourself. In fact, the word he uses here in this new NIV translation is value other people above yourself. Not looking to your own interest, but each of you look into the interest of others. This value to consider, to rank in your head, other people's better than yourself. I think it's a hard thing. And I don't want you, as you're thinking about this and meditating on it, you could get too deep into your own thoughts here. I know when I'm with people sometimes, and especially some people who might be a little bit more challenging, it's a hard verse to apply. And especially if you think you've got to brainwash yourself somehow in order to be, so it's not that, right? It's just you give them extra respect. They're an image bearer of God. Every person you've ever locked eyes with, Jesus died for them. And so we should have a certain willingness to lift up people like that. I mean, really, no matter who they are. And I guess it's especially true with the people who challenge us for whatever reason. Maybe they challenge us because they're hard in meetings. Maybe they challenge us because of so many past conflicts. Maybe they challenge us because they're so much different than us. We just don't have much in common. But he says with people like that, he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition where you're putting yourself forward, or vain conceit, where again, you feel like you've got to be applauded or you've got to be congratulated, where your picture has to be the most liked on Instagram, or where people are all the time thanking you for the stuff you do. You know, a lot of times in marriage and in family and in church, people aren't gonna fall all over themselves to it. Most people are pretty self-focused. Most people are mostly concerned about their own agendas. They don't have much time for yours. And generally where they'll pay attention to your agenda is when your agenda starts to compete with theirs. And then they might come at you pretty hard. A lot of people aren't going to notice your quick achievements. So as Christians, we can stand up against the crowd when we do that sort of thing. And really, any little effort we make in that direction is going to seem monumental because it's so out of character for the human species to think about anybody but themselves. He says, in all these things, I want you to think like Jesus. And so now he's changing the focus, right? And giving us a target to shoot at. He said, I'm not asking you to do something Jesus didn't do. And if you say you're a Christian, if you say you want to follow Jesus, I mean, this ought to be as natural as breathing to you, or at least it ought to become that way. So he said, let's get our head back on Jesus. Remember Jesus, he says, being in the very nature God, didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Some translations will say grasp or clutch to. He didn't think he had to prove anything. Being the very nature God, he didn't consider that stature that he had something worth exalting. He said, on the other hand, he made himself nothing, right? I mean, just by the act of leaving heaven and coming down here to earth, it was a tremendous lowering of himself, a devaluing of it. But he goes further. It says he took the very nature of a servant. Now, what it's saying here about Jesus is that even though he had all the benefits of God, even though he had all the perks of being God, could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, he didn't consider holding on real tightly to that or using it for his own advantage. Instead, he took the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And it says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And it's just like he just keeps descending, It would be, if I have to go do this thing, it would be easy to say, okay, if I'm going to go to earth, I at least want to be a king. If I go to earth, I remember the science fiction movie, The Matrix, when one of the guys gets downloaded in there. He says, well, I want to be somebody famous, somebody important, somebody rich. And Jesus doesn't do any of those things. And so you wonder, well, what is it that inspires him to do it? Well, it says he does it because he's being in the very nature God. Now, some people read that, and when they read it for some reason as in spite of. In spite of the fact that he was just like God, he made himself small. In other words, he's just teaching us a lesson. In spite of the fact that he was like God, he got as small as he could for just a little bit to give us some tips, right? But that's not what it says. It says being in the nature, like because he was God. Well, this is the very kind of thing he would do. If God were to come down here on earth, he probably wouldn't want to sit on a throne. He probably wouldn't want to sit in the White House. He probably would want to be amongst the people. He probably would want to lift others up. That's how God is. That's his whole nature. We have this picture of God in heaven as so powerful, and that's not a bad picture because he is powerful. And we know in the Bible that God sometimes would bring wrath down. Noah's Ark is probably the preeminent story on that, but there were other times where God let his holiness be felt on the people. And Isaiah has a vision of God high and lifted up on his throne, and the train of his robe is filled in the temple, and smoke and angels and seraphim. And certainly there's an aspect of God's personality, which that's very much true. But Paul goes a different direction here. He says because he's just like God, he served. I just think that's such a powerful way to understand who God is. And if this world is God's world, then to kind of get a cheat code for how the world is supposed to work. The God who designed it, his heart beats this way. He goes small. He's a servant, right? He's even willing to lose everything for us. And it says, because of that, because he did those things, that God then exalted him to the highest place and gave him a name above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge or confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Again, you could read this as, okay, well, sure, he came and taught us a little lesson. Now he's right back on the throne, being waited on hand and foot, left and right. And I don't think that's exactly what it's saying. Certainly he's in heaven. And certainly the reward for the servant is that one day you're going to be in heaven too. But I don't think his nature changes, right? I think God in heaven still is hungry to serve. I think that's his nature. I think God with all of his power still cares about a heartbroken teenager. God with all of his power still cares about the addict who has blown it over and over and over again. And God still listens to those prayers. He still loves us. He never quits. And so again, we're getting this picture of what life is supposed to be like and who you're supposed to be. If you really want to know the life of Christ, then you have to be willing to serve. Now, in the moment, when you're the one washing the dishes or mopping the floor or cleaning up the mess, you're not going to feel very exalted. In the moment, when you choose to bite your tongue and not get the last word and let the other person get the applause, when you don't get the credit you feel like you deserved, when it feels like you're giving more than everybody else, you won't feel very exalted. But there will be someone who notices, and there'll be applause in heaven, even though you don't hear it at the time. But I am convinced that the person who commits to walk this way of Jesus has a richer, better, stronger life than the person who does not. There's so many temptations in this life of what you could take and to make your life full. You know, that if you looked a certain way, or if you had a certain bank account, or if you knew the right people, if you went to the right places to eat or to vacation or to shop, that somehow that would take you someplace. And I just think it's empty calories. It's just distractions. The God who made this world was a servant. His love, there's fingerprints of His love in every aspect of this world, but we're broken. And He sends us down here to be His representatives, to live the life that He would have lived if He were here. And I think when you live that kind of life, it's a richer, fuller, better life than anything else you could imagine. And it's my prayer you go get that life.